If you could keep in your thoughts the family of Charles O'Donnell. He passed away last week. He was a school committee member in Hanson, selectman in Hanson, assistant superintendent of Hanover Schools, taught part-time at Massasoit Community College. A great person. His wife Betty has worked in the school system, and if we could keep his family in your thoughts and prayers, I'd appreciate it. Meetings being recorded and televised by the local cable company. Approval of bill and payroll warrants.
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
A motion to accept correspondence in the read file.
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
And the one item on the agenda for this selectmen's meeting, before we have our joint meeting with the Finance Committee, is the report of the Budget Override Evaluation Committee. Randy.
Thank you. So I did give a brief synopsis at our last meeting of what I would be presenting. This report and the Budget Override Committee's evaluations has been sent to the Selectmen for review. I was hoping we could come to some type of consensus prior to the joint meeting with the Finance Committee. So I will start again just by the basic overview. What was determined by the Budget Override Committee was several key factors, and with the help of a consultant, Mr. John Madden, he basically did a forensic look at our town's finances going 5 years back and providing some projections. Key factor that he determined was where we are growing, that our operating budget has annually increased by 4.86%. He notes that school growth from 7 to 8% are not the norm. His recommendation, and it will be a vote later on in this meeting, was to restrict operational growth to somewhere between 2 to 2.5% and a school assessment of 5%. Now, several factors into that. He said they're not concrete numbers. You may need some adjustment here and there, but these are what he considers the norms for surrounding towns and towns meeting our demographics. I did go over the consultant summary the last meeting. I'm sure everyone's read through it. So I would like to get into the voting on the recommendations. So the first recommendation was a restructuring removal of the ambulance account. And what he is saying that will do is, if we move that to a general revenue source, will provide the town with much needed revenue. Now, we're obviously not going to take needed money away from the fire department, and if we read the recommendation, the motion originally was for $160,000 a year. We felt like that needed some little bit more detail, a little more in-depth analysis with the fire chief, Frank, and you probably will see some movement in that, probably close to $200,000 a year. So that motion of restructuring this ambulance account did unanimously pass the Budget Committee's vote, and it may be something that our board should vote on for recommendation to the Finance Committee. So I would entertain, if it,
Would you like to do them all at the end, or would you like to go one by one?
no, we can do them all at the end.
Okay. Because you're recommending that all of them be.
Right, so the next is the motor vehicle fine account. Again, this is basically just a movement where these accounts are going into general revenue to support entire town-wide operations. We have an average salary of about, average annual collection of about 52,000. We've seen a slight decrease, and this basically has been going for police department capital purchases and expenses. We will need to recognize those when we remove this count, but just for a little bit more cohesive operation, it was recommended that this account just gets moved to a general revenue source. Another account along the same lines is the sewer water indirect costs. Now, this has been an account that has been a consistent source of what ends up becoming free cash, which has enabled us to, was one way of helping us pay for the police station, fire department, town hall renovations prior to the debt exclusion. This will, by moving this account, you will see about 500,000 plus now fall into a general revenue source, which we can use annually rather than just roll over into free cash at the end of the year. It now becomes that revenue source that's just not a one-time, wouldn't be used for just one-time purchases at the end of the year. Again, all three of those motions passed the budget override committee unanimously. The next one is the operating budget recommendations and a school budget recommendation. This to me is a key point and what will enable us to get through another year. Slightly from the norm, obviously, when we recommend 2.5%, it's dropping down from 4%. Education, the assessment would be a 5% assessment increase. I'll speak on that in 1 minute. So by limiting departments, we should see a solid, we'll be maintaining a very solid level of services. At 2.5%, we will not see a decrease in services. Education this year, 5% assessment. If you look back to what it has been previously, we've probably averaged 7, 8.5, maybe even slightly higher.
Slightly higher. I mean, if you do a 4-year average, we're well over 8.
With the complexity of this year and running some rough numbers based off the statutory method, 5.5, an assessment up to 5.5% will be able to maintain services, level service budget within the school district by the town of Whitman. Obviously, to continue that, would definitely need a further look into to maintain level services beyond. Again, that passed the budget override committee unanimously. What was also discussed was free cash or one-time money, which the town has previously used to, in necessity, fund things. The consultant actually commended us for getting this far, doing that, but feels it is a practice that this town now needs to stay away from. So a recommendation to use free cash for one-time capital expenditures or one-time purchases also passed unanimously. Capital projects and spending, we did speak slightly on the Collins report, feeling that town needs to make its best step forward into trying to fund that as much as possible. We spoke on 2 capital projects of note. The first being construction of a new DPW facility. The committee recommends that a warrant article is placed on the warrant. The funding, which needs to still be determined, be figured out to do a reevaluation study, feasibility, architectural plans, and needs. Also passed unanimously. And Frank, if you want to add anything on that, or
Yeah, we, as you know, we've been, the oldest project on the list right now is the DPW. I did speak to Jeff Alberti of, I'm drawing a blank here. The folks who did our original feasibility study, and explained to him that we're now looking at it as a base building, and invited him to give me some updated information on the market as it pertains to those buildings. He will be sending that. But it really is something that's a critical need right now. And we can't move forward unless we know what the ultimate cost is going to be. So that feasibility is a really important part of that process. You want to get into the other one?
Next project of note we spoke about was the middle school. So for the folks watching, on December 11th, MSBA determined that the middle school would fall into the queue as a high priority project. That speaks volumes of the shape the middle school's in. I believe there were 61, 63 projects in contention, and 11 were chosen. Whitman was one of those 11 projects.
We're the only first-time one.
Yes, this was the first time we had applied and immediately chosen to go into the first phase. So what that means for the town is, and this is an estimate from the superintendent. The town would need to commit $750,000 for a first phase feasibility study. What was talked about was 3 possible ways to fund that feasibility study. One way was free cash. To be noted that the use of $750,000 of free cash may limit some capital projects. That still is to be determined. It's kind of early in the budgeting phase to see what exactly needs to be done. The other second option would be a one-time capital exclusion, and the third option would have been a debt exclusion bonded over a specific period of time. The third option, I believe, is how the Collins Center recommended. Am I correct, Justin?
It was not as excluded debt. They wanted to fund it within the operating budget as a bond over 5 years.
Okay.
Right, they wanted to borrow.
Yeah.
So after much discussion, and basically it went back to what was free cash and did we have the free cash to do it? The Budget Override Committee did feel that this project fell within the realms of what free cash should be used for, and a vote was taken passing. The motion was to the town to appropriate funds from free cash to pay for this, and that was an 802 vote. Moving on, one of the general recommendations of the Override Committee was developing a strategic plan. Now, this is something that we've talked about for a while now. If you look at best practice, it's clearly a best practice, and I think going forward will be a key piece of determining where we will be in the next 3 to 5 years, and more importantly, how we should get there. So the committee makes a motion to seek on the warrant a funding source to be determined. I believe Lisa is looking into it with Frank, and that did pass unanimously. Lastly, the committee wrap-up was, are we or are we not going to seek a Proposition 2.5 override for fiscal 2021? The committee spoke quite a bit, feels that adopting these recommendations in their entirety, and that's key to say that. I think this is a puzzle that all these pieces need to fall into. I don't think we can pick and choose these. We're pulling revenue from different places, and the committee felt voted 9-1. The motion was not to recommend an override for fiscal 2021. That being said, if you go back to the original Madden report, more than likely in fiscal 2022, it may be unavoidable. But I'm not willing to say that yet, but we still have some difficult challenges ahead to get over, and that may clear up that picture. But I'm confident to say that in fiscal 21, with basically a lot of, probably the last of our budget tightening within our budgets, that we're going to be able to really tie these departments down with a lot of being very conservative, asking that our department heads follow that same path throughout the year. We will be able to maintain services and not seek an override.
Randy, thank you. Does anyone have any questions about the report?
Yes, I have a couple for you, Randy.
Okay?
On the sewer and water indirect costs. Now, you're saying that's money that's come out of the water and sewer enterprise fund that's been paying for things that should be considered out of the general fund, such as, I think we were taking like a certain amount of employee payroll out of the enterprise fund?
So sewer, water, and direct costs are basically costs that the town bills.
We provide support services for the enterprise. We provide accounting, we provide management, we provide financial support.
Right.
And all of those things have a cost. And while they're distributed over the general fund budget, the enterprise also receives those benefits, but they don't contribute revenue to the
Right.
general fund.
Rent. That's a good
So
way of putting it.
we have an accounting process whereby we assess indirect costs to the enterprise. Now, the way we've been doing it is the enterprise budget is prepared. We have our revenues on top. We have our expenses on the bottom. And one of the expense lines is indirect costs. And it's over 500,000. I don't know what the exact number is right now.
512.
But that amount of money is what we recognize based on accounting analysis is due to the town for services. However, because it's in that budget line, we can't take it into revenue through an accounting transaction because we're basically charging twice for the same service.
Right.
The services are already paid for in the regular budget.
General fund, yeah.
So this money sits there, and when we close our books at the end of the year, it dumps into free cash. What that does is it costs us $500,000 for which we're not receiving appropriate revenue. We're putting a burden on the general fund to the $2.5 million. What the consultant has recommended is, as part of our budget, we prepare, let's call it an article, that will effectively recognize that money as less to be raised in the levy. It's not necessarily revenue, but it's an offset to what we have to tax.
Right.
So by doing that,
You're identifying where it's.
for
where it's been
example,
spent. Yeah.
we're going to levy $28 million. We will fund 27.5 out of taxation and 500,000 out of funds from the enterprise. That's mechanically the way it would work. What it does is it takes the money that we already know is there and allows us to use it. The trade-off is that it'll be less money in free cash. But remember, free cash is what was
One-time
paying
stuff, yeah.
for the project for the police, town hall, and fire. Now that that's in the levy, that free cash doesn't have to be reserved for that purpose. So it can go to reduce the total burden.
Okay.
Hope that explains it.
Yeah, understandable. All right, and another one that you have that you are recommending that all departments stay within a 2.5%, but there may be some exceptions to that increase. And I would say that the Finance Committee, if there's any department, regardless of who it is, that goes over that 2.5% increase, take a really serious look at it, because there may be some areas where we could cut certain small things, nickels add to dimes, dimes add to dollars. And I guess my last question is the vote on the override. You had a 9-1 in favor of the motion. One person voted against it. I was just curious why. The reasoning. I hate to put somebody on the spot.
She's here.
Like you just did.
Well, I mean, you want to hear all reasons. Sorry.
Yeah. Don Byers, 20 Russell Road. I voted against, or the motion was to not recommend an override. I said no. I believed that throughout the process, we saw a lot of information on revenue and how to receive more money into the Article 2 for the operating budget. But I didn't see any expenditure reports or proposed Article 2 or how this new revenue or money was going to be distributed and paid out. So I also recall in May of 2018, town administrator said at town meeting, we're in a difficult position and we're going to be faced with an override. And in May of 2019, we also got by without an override. I stand here as a school committee member and know that the schools did cut from their budget last year. So I feel that to recommend not having an override this year doesn't serve the people in our community, the families in our community, the working families in our community. I think we need to recognize our true expenditures with our real revenue. And schools are working on the same budget that they cut last year. So.
Okay. What I heard from Randy, though, is that you're recommending this, but it may not happen. We're recommending no override, but if in a couple of months from now we realize that it's not feasible,
No.
we may have to ask for it, or this is...
Dan, if we're going to do an override, the time to put that out and present the arguments for it is already passed.
Okay.
We're in January, a meeting is coming in less than 4 months. I don't think it's enough time to digest everything that's happening right now. We have a change in how we're funding the school today that has some impact on why this may be postponed till next year. And I think in actuality, it is a postponement. We are going to need an override. If we're going to fund the services that people need, and we're going to fund and commit to a long-term capital plan, $1 million of that has to come from the levy. And today, there isn't $1 million to provide. We do have the ability today to fund what we need for fiscal '21, but we don't have the ability to continue doing that because we're using available funds right now for capital, and we can't commit to borrowing unless we have a way to pay for that borrowing.
Right. So,
And I'm not talking about debt exclusions. I'm talking about basic capital projects that are long-term plans that are on the agenda
Right.
that ultimately will be funded, but they'll be funded within the levy. And the way we'll do that is we're going to take on approximately $1 million in debt. And that debt will be cycling. As one project pays off, another project comes on. But that all has to be part of the system. And frankly, this assessment, I think, took a little longer than we'd hoped it would. because there were so many moving pieces.
Well, if we-
this were October, we'd be talking something different.
Right. Now, if we maintain the practice that the Budget Override Evaluation Committee has set forth with a certain increase on a regular basis, and we need to watch our budgets and deal with it and make sure we follow that, we may, continue to work in the best practices in getting the job done.
Well, so I guess now we've heard why one person voted for it, so I guess I'll explain why 9 people voted in favor of the motion. So I think when you go to ask the public for an override, it's a dire situation. What we know right now is, 1, we can meet our requirements. We will maintain services. We will provide funding to the school that at a minimum will meet their requested, but the school provided a budget. We have not gotten a school budget yet, but what we know is we do have a number that they will require for level service, or maintain service, so they're not going back. Could we meet that? Yes, we can. So what are the other questions? What does provide sustainability? What do we need long-term? Well, we know we have a middle school possibly on the horizon. We know we have a capital service project. We do not know what the number is for the school district. Now, like I mentioned prior, 5% probably, if we look at our history, will not be sustainable to the school to get there. They will need an increase. So, very complex issue. We are trying to get through this year working with our partner community. There is a burden that's been placed on them. We need to recognize that burden. Is this the year to ask for more? I don't know. I'm not going to make that decision, but I personally don't think it is the year to try and ask for more, but I don't think the school should go back. And if we can meet it, we meet that requirement. So, and they have not provided a budget of what they're going to go for yet. So there are a lot of moving pieces.
Yeah.
So was this the year? No, evidently not. 9-1. I think the strategic plan is going to be critical in saying not only where we need to go, but how we get there. And that's wrapping all these pieces up that we've put together. Now, it's taken a lot longer than some people probably have hoped. It's government. It moves slow. I think it's very tough.
Better to get it right.
I think it's very tough to get the train out of the station, but once it gets moving, it keeps moving.
Right.
And I think this board has shown that the intention is there, that we are focused, we're moving now. We have one more piece. We have done these town-wide survey. We've had a consultant come in, look at our budget, gave us recommendations, recommendations based on this town, but recommendations based on best practice financial policy. That's where a lot of these recommendations come from. It is financial policy that this town probably should have done a better job with down the road. But you know what? We've recognized the issue. We're not going to look back, and we're going to implement these things. We have more information to find out. I think this override will be the last time we can ask taxpayers for money for quite a long time. We better get it right. And if we can meet our needs and work on getting it right, providing that last step, detailing, if we're saying we need to get the schools to within 5%, well, what is that? What is that number 5 years down the road? They've provided a budget with 3 separate levels. What's the sustainability of that? That's the number we need. There's some missing pieces, and I don't think it was the best time in this community's interest to try and throw up a Hail Mary and make a guess on that.
Right. Okay.
Anyone else?
I would actually just like to ask about the both the ambulance account and the motor vehicle fine account are structural changes to accounts. Do those both require votes at town meeting to?
Yes.
Okay.
And we, yes, they both require town meeting approval.
Okay. And then the sewer, water, indirect costs will be an annual vote at town meeting.
Correct.
Okay.
I'd like to entertain a motion to accept the report of the Budget Override Evaluation Committee and endorse the their recommendations.
I'll make that report. Very good job, Randy. Your
Second.
committee.
Is there any discussion? I'd like to also say I agree with both Don and Randy, which isn't easy to do. But the town, we've known for a long time that town is going to need to have an override to be able to afford what the townspeople said in their survey they want for services. On the other hand, Randy is totally right about the moving pieces, about the timing, and about the good information and advice that we received from this committee.
Chairman, may I add a follow-up comment? You're right, the schools have not presented an approved budget yet, and the schools do have needs, so the comment was that there's enough in the budget this year to meet the town's needs, and we haven't seen the schools' approved budget yet. And we know that they need 19 positions restored. So I would like to add that comment. Thank you.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, that exhausts this meeting. Motion to adjourn is in order. Oh, we adjourn into the next, we adjourn right into the next meeting. A motion to invite the Finance Committee to hang out.
Mr. Chairman, we have 9 members of the Finance Committee here tonight, and it was our expectation that this was to be a joint meeting.
Yes.
And obviously, we're not all going to fit in 2 chairs. I would like to perhaps entertain a motion to take an adjournment and set up the room for an appropriate joint meeting.
Okay. We'll take a hiatus
5-minute recess?
for a recess for a few
Thank
minutes.
you.
Yeah.
Of this meeting and where we are. And just for the record, I can tell you that my employer knows where I am not, and that's at work right now. So if in fact I have to leave, I just understand that my shift starts at 7. So, but seriously, there are many ways that we need to get to where we need to be, and undoubtedly we'll disagree on some of the paths. But I think it's important that the Board of Selectmen and the Finance Committee are collaborating and systematically building a plan to address our deficiencies, and I think it makes for a solid foundation. So personally, I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank the members of the Finance Committee and the Board of Selectmen who have obviously taken a huge step forward in where we need to go. So beyond that, I will yield the chair to you, Mr. Chairman, for the...
To go through the list?
Yes.
Okay, the 2021 budget review. Now, since you made the agenda, I'm expecting you to carry the...
Right, it was my hope, actually, that the agenda would be, jointly created by the Selectmen and the Finance Committee. So if there are agenda items that you're not prepared to discuss, and I would suggest that in order to discuss the fiscal 2021 budget, an Article 2 would be necessary. We have a copy of an Article 2 that was created for the Finance Committee on November 26th. And this Article 2 is based on submissions that were received by the Finance Committee, by the budget managers submitting their budgets. So I would have suggested that we would look, generally speaking, at the total line for each department and just generally have a discussion about how these submissions came in. So I think Frank was very instrumental in helping to assemble the budget mailing, and also Frank has received all of the budgets from town departments that the Finance Committee has received. So would you say that you think it would be necessary for the Board of Selectmen to have an Article 2 before them to discuss this?
I understood that one of the points of this meeting was to talk about how we approach the 2021 budget, what limitations we're going to set, because the budgets that were submitted in November may not fully resemble the budget that will be on the floor in May.
I would say that would be an understatement, yes.
So I think the first step in this process is to identify what our budget tolerances are. Where are we? As we know, when we prepare budgets, not every budget's a cookie cutter. However, the financial controls would indicate that a 2.5% increase should be our goal for the total budget. And as we look at each individual department, we're going to see issues with that. So we really are taking a step back and looking at how we're going to approach this.
So I would say the need then for a subsequent joint meeting with the Board of Selectmen would be to include a review of Article 2 as it's been presented to us. Would you agree with that? The next meeting with the joint meeting with the Board of Selectmen, do you think that is
I would
necessary?
hope between now and then we would have looked at those budgets and made some revisions.
Yeah, okay.
Can I make a comment? I think it was clear today by the vote of the Budget Override Committee and also by the Board of Selectmen that what was supplied to us to create what we now have as an Article 2 is going to be, as Frank said, significantly different than what was just all voted. I mean, we had several departments come into us with 8 and 10% increases. So I think it's important for the department heads to hear that the votes have been, not only from the Budget Override Committee, but also from the Board of Selectmen. And I know we've had this vote already in the FinCom that 2.5% is where we are going to be. Now, I don't think it's up to the Finance Committee or the Board of Selectmen to tell a department head how to get there, but I think it's important that they know that and that they should be tasked to go back and revisit their budget and how they're going to get it to 2.5% instead of the 6 or 7 that they supplied to us.
We had a vote or a discussion? Because I don't remember having a vote.
Yeah, we have discussed it.
We did,
Okay.
correct. I apologize. We straw polled it, maybe. I think we were all pretty much in favor of the 2.5 and 5. But yes, we did not have an official vote.
But to go back to the, communicating with the budget managers, I know you've had a budget manager meeting, and this subject obviously was discussed. So maybe it's at the point now where we should ask for a resubmission of budgets based on the vote of the Board of Selectmen tonight? Would you say that makes sense?
Based on tonight's vote, each department is going to have to look at what they've requested and how they can get within conforming to that guideline, and if they can't, to justify it.
So I'm in agreement with Mr. Galvin in that the department and the budget managers should be the ones that are deciding, how they're going to get to that percentage. So I would think that we should offer a deadline, though, because typically we were be scheduling our second meeting with departments in advance of town meeting. So, that takes quite a time to go through the cycle. So we have completed meetings with all departments, the initial meetings, but again, if we were going to have a follow-up meeting with some or all of the budget managers, we should request and receive revised budgets before, I would say, the end of February.
I would suggest, and more than suggest, I'm going to ask for a meeting of all the departments in a collective setting with revised numbers so that we can talk about them and get an understanding of where we're going. I would like to do that probably the first week of February so that we have a working document that reflects these guidelines, and we can identify where there are issues. I don't see any reason to meet with a department to go over a budget that complies with what's being requested. I just don't think that's necessary. It makes work where what we need to identify are those issues that are significant and need to be addressed. And I mean, we do this not in a vacuum because we know that there are budgets within Article 2 that are not even going to come close to 2.5%. County retirement, I think it's 11. Insurance, I think, is 5. Maybe the first time we can get health insurance to fall into that parameter. But there are numbers that are going to have to be made up for. And the only effective way to do that is to have a round meeting. I'll invite the Finance Committee or members of the Finance Committee to come. That's a working meeting. It's generally not a meeting in this format where we televise it and the public comes in. I'm not suggesting we withhold anything from the public, but it's a working meeting, and those typically are not meetings under what's defined as an open meeting. And in part, I guess, because some of the discussions we have are going to be difficult. So I think that's what we need to do to approach the budget.
Yep. I fully agree, and then we are definitely prepared to participate in that format as well, so.
And I would just add, and this is coming, and I would hope everyone on the FinCom had received a copy of the Madden report, because his recommendations are really detailed in that, quite a bit of graphs and charts of how he reached his conclusion. But I do, one line stood out to me, and it's discipline and a general reality check are needed to restrict increases that better reflect revenue availability. If you continue on, more often than not, increases seen in other communities reflect increases in the range of 2 to 2.5%. We've gone to the higher end of that. This is where the Board of Selectmen, the FinCom, we need to practice that fiscal responsibility now, which you've seen last year, this year. I mean, we are working hard for the taxpayer out there. I would say anybody that comes to you beyond that better have it show exigency of why they need beyond that. Like Frank alluded to, fixed costs are going to be unavoidable falling out of that 2.5. Beyond that, there should be a definitive need.
Can I say something, Carl? One comment that I'd like to make is the fact that when you look at the entire town budget, there are some departments that are not going to be 2.5. They may be level funded. They may be 1%. It's the bottom line number. There are some departments that may need more, for certain reasons. You know, something's coming up, they have to do it, or we have, whether it's police, fire, DPW, the three huge town departments, right, and the schools, that may have to be a little bit more, or a lot more, but I think it's the bottom line at the end, is the town within the 2.5 total budget increase. So, I mean, I guess you just got to look at budgets and very carefully and get the bottom line and see where we're going with it.
Okay, so as far as the process going forward, let me make sure I have it clear.
Chairman, could I ask a question?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay, actually, it's 3 questions. I appreciate the fact that working meetings don't necessarily have to be televised, but I also believe that the public needs to know what the difficult decisions are. Right now, the general public in Whitman does not know the details of what was involved in last year's decisions to stay under an override, avoiding an override for fiscal 20. So the closed-door meetings, I understand, involve less formal discussions than you'd have when you're televised, but they have to be open to the public so they know what's at stake. My second point is, how can you vote to not approve, take off the table the option of an override when you don't really have the numbers yet? And I know it's 2.5%, 2 to 2.5% for all budgets except for the schools and 5% for the schools. But it's 2 to 2.5% except for, we've already heard already, county insurance. I know that the town clerk is going to need more money because of the election year, so there are all sorts of but. So I don't believe that the FinCom or the Board of Selectmen has real numbers to base a vote to take an override off the table. And my final point is, how long do you think it takes to run a successful override? It doesn't take 6 months. It does not. I come from a different community. I've only been in Whitman for 4 years, but I was a 9-year member of the Milton School Committee where we passed overrides in the matter of about 2 to 3 months, where you educate the public, and I'm not advocating for an override at this point, but if we need one, we can't take it off the table before we know what the numbers are. And it doesn't take 6 months. I think it's unrealistic to say it takes 8 months. I don't know if anybody up there has an idea of how long it takes, but it doesn't take 6 months or 4 months. You educate the public, they say yes or no, then you go back to the hard realities of, okay, we only have the approval for a certain bottom line. But taking an override off the table at this point, I think, is premature.
Can I make a comment on that, Cal?
Sure.
On the override, I understand what you're saying, and the difference between Whitman and Milton, because I worked in Milton. I ran a store, Star Market there. You have a very large business base, and I don't know what your factor is. Was the factor on business and homeowners the same?
Yes, and we didn't have a big commercial base in Milton. We absolutely did not.
More than Whitman.
If I may, to address Mrs. Otina's question about timing, the last override we did was a culmination of, Tim, you here? How long were you promoting the override to hire the 4 firefighters? I want to say 8 months, 9 months?
Started in September.
The one before it, we talked about an override in January. We put it on the ballot in May, and it went down in flames. I can't tell you what works in one community is going to work in another. I can tell you that we have historically found it very difficult to get people interested in what's going on. Now, maybe a lot of that has to do with the type of coverage we get from the media. The information isn't out there. We have lots of open meetings. I have department meetings. They're not public meetings for the simple reason that they're internal management. I don't need 9,000 people saying, here's how we think you should manage your operation. The town meeting is a participatory program where we present information and they make a determination on whether or not they wish to fund it. They're a legislative group. That, in fact, the state defines town meeting as our local legislature. I would be hard-pressed to find 100 people that would regularly be interested in knowing what's going on. That doesn't mean we don't provide it, but it means we have a lot of things to do. We have a lot of work that we put together. I don't think people want to come and sit here and watch me working with a computer or calculator, and that's a lot of what we do at those meetings. And I disagree with you. I don't think that they're going to be effective if we're trying to coordinate business operations and we have people coming in who have no understanding of it, and we spend half our time explaining why we're saying what we're doing or doing what we're doing, because it doesn't help us when we get to the budget process, because those people may or may not even be at town meeting, but the information isn't going to be as useful as the information we'll provide in budget analyses. And we did commit to a more fluid and informative process for the budget. So it's not going to be 2 weeks before town meeting we have Article 2 out there. It's going to be very public.
I understand that, and you may have misunderstood me. I don't expect it to be an open meeting, subject to open meeting laws, but what I don't want is a closed-door meeting where certain discussions are taking place and the public doesn't realize how difficult the decisions are that are being made.
Well,
It's
those
in the
decisions
public's
have to
best
be,
interest.
Well, I would ask, can you clarify that?
The public doesn't know how hard it is to, I sat through my first, this is my
No,
first year on
just,
finance.
are you talking budget, or are you talking something else?
I'm talking about the services that people don't realize they're getting and the stress that it puts on the different departments, that these don't come easily. These decisions don't come easily, and it takes sometimes 45 minutes to get a quorum at town meeting, so I appreciate how difficult it is to generate the civic interest that this town needs to be informed. But I think that the meetings that you're envisioning should be published, the information coming out of those meetings should be publicized so that the
agree.
people know these are the difficult decisions that were made with a working group trying to do the best thing for the town of Whitman to maintain the services that they want and keep the tax levy increases to a bare minimum, not to zero.
I don't know what meetings you're talking about, because the Budget Override Committee was televised, open meeting televised every week.
I'm talking about the meeting that that Frank has mentioned about getting the
Getting the
department heads, the
department heads
budget
together.
manager, getting the budget
that's
manager
not
A
together.
department head meeting is never televised.
I'm not suggesting it should be.
Well, that's the meeting he's talking about.
I'm not suggesting they be televised, Mr. Lamartina. I'm suggesting that when these meetings are held
So you,
and the difficult
I'm just
decisions
trying
are
to figure,
made.
please don't, like,
And the
get
difficult decisions are being
There's no need to
made.
get testy, I'm just asking you for
People are
clarification.
informed about the difficult decisions that were made, that you don't come out of the meeting and not talk to the reporter, and the reporter does a good job at reporting information in the town. And see, these are the decisions that were made to bring the services to the town at this level of taxation.
Just, there's one thing we all need to understand. The decisions won't be made at that meeting. The decisions will be made here. We will present the information to the selectmen, as they did last year with that two-pass budget. The department heads don't have the authority to set a budget. They request it. They don't have the authority, in most cases, to change the services that they provide. They're either statutorily required or they're subject to review and approval by the board. So, I'm trying to, I guess I'm trying to understand
Business.
or maybe clarify for myself if I understand what you're saying. You're looking for us to strategize, to come up with ideas and budgets and schedules, and then to present that information publicly. Am I correct?
In a way that's accountable to the town survey, when the town said what they prioritized, to make sure that budgets are being made or financing is being made in a way that prioritizes what the town wants. Having these meetings or having no access to know how these decisions are being made, I think gives less access to the public to know how we're working towards making the priorities that they set forth with their survey.
I think we're really hung up on a process here.
Yeah, with all due
Well,
respect,
I wanted to
have
get back to clarify the process going forward, because I thought we had one, and I'm not sure it's being served by this discussion, to tell you the truth.
Well,
Frank,
can I just put a bow on this? And
Excuse
the
me?
Finance Committee's job to take that information that department heads give them, hash it out, understand it, and bring it to the people. That's our recommendation. That's the job of the Finance Committee. So I'd have to disagree with my counterparts here, is that to have a working group meeting, other than how it's described by the Board of Selectmen, is not necessary.
But the working group meeting last year excluded one of the departments completely, am I correct? Didn't it exclude the schools?
Wasn't at that meeting, I don't know.
Yeah, nor was I, so we don't know, but that's what we're hearing. And that's the sort of information we should
That's the role of
know.
the Finance Committee. The Finance Committee has to get that information.
Well, I think, just to move on the discussion of the budget, I think we're in agreement that the next step is
next
for the
step
town administrator
to have a meeting with the...
set up a meeting with the budget managers and involve...
the first week of February.
Members of the Finance Committee to get that information as soon as possible and to
Right.
analyze it well in advance of town meeting, so...
And that will give you the information you need to have your second meeting with the department heads.
If in fact that's necessary.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
if the budget managers come to that meeting with...
And they all fold, then
Oh, well.
we don't need it.
I don't know, fold is the right word.
Well, maybe that was the wrong choice of words.
Yeah, no, I would say
Okay.
that wouldn't be.
I do want to
And
go back.
as far as, as far as informing the public, anything that came out of, what came out of that meeting last year, this closed-door meeting that people are fixated on, was discussed at length at our meeting before we went forward, and with the joint
Well,
meeting with
we
you.
followed up on that meeting and actually, used the information that came out of that meeting for our final recommendations.
Right,
So,
exactly.
it wasn't without purpose, but I understand, the concern, but I think it's important that we recognize that we're using that information in our final recommendation, but it's not driving the bus, that's all, so.
Okay, so as far as budget review is concerned,
I think we're in a
clear
good
on what's-
place if the recommendation is to follow it up with budget managers. I think for this committee, I think that's probably the best next step for us, so
Okay.
I'd be comfortable for
And it'll be,
moving on.
it'll make your meetings more productive after that's happened.
No doubt about it.
Capital improvement plan, you wanted to
So,
What are you thinking about that?
in the pre-meeting, I guess, of tonight, the discussion was specifically to two specific capital projects. So, we have a capital project evaluation committee that does a very good job to identify projects. We have a huge amount of projects in the queue. So I think it's important for us to sit jointly and to discuss them, maybe at a subsequent meeting, because obviously we don't have all that information before us, to figure out which, in fact, projects are going to be prioritized in a year where we're not considering a 2.5 override. So I would suggest that is something that we should be discussing. So that's why I put it on the draft agenda.
Strategic improvement plan.
That should be part of our strategic plan.
Yeah.
Obviously, to look at the queue and also to look at a process.
Well, I would say one thing, and I think this came up in the budget override committee, was committees need to be careful of scope creep, creeping into others' responsibility. The way I foresee the capital plan, that is the job of the capital improvement committee. They should present to you what their determinations are. You're the committee that determines what funding they get, what is available. It is not the job, if a role-specific committee is created, it's not the job for another committee to override that.
Right, and
I mean, I guess other than the Board of Selectmen having the ultimate say of what goes on the warrant, the capital committee should be, you disagree with that statement? And I'm
No,
not saying to
I think
override,
it's
but I guess we ultimately control what is placed on the warrant. And that's based on the recommendations of yourselves, the capital committee. I don't think you've ever seen a situation where that's been different. So
I guess the question would be, when would the capital committee be ready for their final recommendations to present to the selectmen and to the FinCom? Because I know in the original article that the capital committee was founded, those deadlines have already passed. I believe it was a January deadline that they were supposed to have. Now, I understand that committee has just really reorganized, so obviously willing to give them some leeway in getting those numbers finalized, but we're also running up against a deadline of figuring out how much money we have to spend in Article 2 and how much needs to be allocated.
Okay, what we spend in Article 2 should not be at all impacted by capital funds. And if they
I
are,
agree.
then we're in a bigger problem than I think we
No, I
are.
agree. It's actually the other way around.
Yeah.
But it's knowing what is, a high requested capital item versus, where we're going to be. I mean, ideally, it's great to know how much money you have to spend, understand how much capital you want to spend, and then, geez, do we have enough left over for the budget? No, we don't. Okay, well, where do we start lopping off the capital? And, I actually emailed out a revenue forecast that I've been working on with the town accountant. I'm not sure if the entire Board of Selectmen got it, but, to start in a process of evaluating our revenues to see and start questioning, are these estimates accurate? How much do we have to spend? If we can come up with how much we have to spend, it makes it a lot easier to know if our budget is going to be able to need an override or not. And, with our initial calculations, we don't believe so. Mr. Madden has assisted us in that. He forecasted out revenue. So yeah, we do have pretty solid forecasts from Mr. Madden on if we implement these recommendations, that we wouldn't need an override. And the work that I've been doing, I am right right alongside with. So I guess my question is, how long does the capital committee think before they're completed with their analysis?
I think what you have to first digest is the presentation that was made tonight was a very important part of answering that question. If we were seeking an override, it would be a different answer than if we decided as a collective to work within the bounds of 2.5 this year. The consultant was also pretty specific in noting that while these are all recommendations, the likelihood is this year it's going to be flat because we're working on what's available for capital, which is free cash. And there's a recommendation on the table that 750,000 of that be committed to a study. So 1.9 becomes 1.15. We never want to spend down free cash. That's one of the worst budgeting concepts you can do, because that's your cushion for the next year. And if it's a bad year and you don't have free cash and you spend it all, you start off in the hole. So, I'm thinking that there's going to be a couple of $100,000 that isn't going to be available in any event. So what we have to do is we have to take the projects we have, the costs associated with it, and how we're going to fund them. And the only funding we have this year for capital is a couple of lease purchases that we're making second or third payments on, and then the balance is what's available in cash, because we don't have a solid footing to go out and borrow to fund capital. That's part of the projection for fiscal '22. So I guess the answer is we'll, I assume, have a meeting within the next week or two, and we will identify what we have available for funds and how we would recommend allocating those funds. Is that fair?
Yeah, our next meeting is scheduled for the first week in February. And our goal, you're right, John, the committee has just recently reformed. And just to echo what Frank said, is that a lot of the decisions that were made here tonight affects how that committee will make recommendations. And specifically, the Collins report had a matrix associated with how they prioritize projects. With these decisions made tonight, that matrix now changes. I don't think it's going to ultimately affect the current numbering of projects, but we've committed to, one is using the Collins report as a guideline, two, adhering to the language that was approved at town meeting and the role of the capital committee, and three, not only just recommend projects, but recommend projects in a fiscally sound manner.
I would just add to that, the board did tonight recommend that we change the way that we use the ambulance account and the motor vehicle fine account, which would impact the ranking of the Collins Center's reporting. So things that had funds set aside for those projects already got bumped up. So we may see some police and fire projects shift down in the list.
If I may, so just a little observation on, this is my 4th or 5th year in FinCom. A lot of things are changing now. We're finally getting some of the wheels to turn, but they are turning a little slowly. In the past, some of these capital requests would come in as articles from department heads, some that would fall under it, not big ones, but some that would still be there. So I think maybe for some of the newer members, and with the capital committee reforming, they're really going to be the energy to move that along to us. As in the past, it came in a lot of different ways. So there's a lot of different things going on here, and it might be a little tough this year, but hopefully we get everything in a straight line where we can follow.
Will there be any articles that don't come in through the capital committee, or will they all come in through the?
There shouldn't be. If an article, there is a provision in the structure of the capital committee that says an article can be presented without a recommendation from the capital committee, but it has to go to the selectmen, and there has to be a reason for that. It has to be something extraordinary, something, an unanticipated, immediately needed. And I would expect those as well to go through capital analysis, because unless we create a format and a process, we're going to have these problems every year. This year's going to be a little tricky. I'm not even sure how the capital article is going to be worded. I don't know if we're going to have a capital article and then the committee's responsible for its implementation, or if we're going to have a series of articles carrying a recommendation from the Finance Committee and the Capital Committee. So we're going to have to work out that process
List of
as
articles
well.
and the costs. In fact, why not one article, list of items and the cost?
So I say, we have to work out that process.
Then you have the problem if that
It would be a
fails.
big change from what
oh,
we've
yeah.
done, and you're right. If the article's $990,000, and for some reason, there's some angst over it, and it fails, now we have no capital plan.
Oh, true. Yeah, I never thought about that. You kill everything, you get it all, or you kill it. Kill
So
it.
perhaps what we'll have is a list of capital projects by line that add up, and if we vote the whole number, we vote the whole number. If not, then we go one at a time.
Oh, yeah.
Gain the confidence, maybe that'll happen someday.
And again, town meeting belongs to the people who show up.
Right.
We're there to facilitate, but they're there to make the decisions.
So as far as next steps, Mr. Chairman, I'm comfortable with the fact that the Capital Projects Committee will be meeting in the first week of February to map out a strategy. And I also agree with, Chuck, that a comprehensive evaluation by that committee prior to it coming before the Finance Committee and the Board of Selectmen will only make the process better.
Did you cover strategic improvement? Did we cover that?
We haven't.
Strategic improvement plan?
Strategic
Whatever
planning.
whatever you wanted to.
So, I mean, that's, one of the things that we're going to be moving into
We're
in
going
the
to
next
be moving into,
round.
we may be putting an article on the Maytown meeting floor to help finance it. It's been being written for the last 9 months or so.
Without a doubt.
With the work of particularly Randy's committee and the survey is part of it too. When we can't forget what was said on the survey. The people that responded, and it was a good response, told us what they valued in the town in kind of an order, but they also told us they didn't want to pay for it. So that's why we're having this kind of a discussion right now.
And you know what also really, Mr. Chairman, you can't be understated too, is the fact that there have been some very vocal members of the public who have pushed for this for many years.
Mm-hmm.
And, it is nice to actually see it coming to fruition. And I think we're moving down the path a lot faster than we had been, so.
Yes. What about the Prop 2.5 override recommendation? What did you?
So I think,
kind of.
that pretty much covered it, the pre-meeting for our joint meeting, more or less, unless anybody has any other additional things.
Gives you a direction, even if.
So we
you're
know
all
what
not
to
unanimous.
expect. Generally speaking, we've come before this committee typically in January, talked about, where we've been, where we're going, and hopefully come to a consensus that we are going to move there collectively with the Board of Selectmen and the Finance Committee, because we have the same goals. So again, it's just communicating with each other about the process and the timing. I'm in agreement that the 2.5 override is necessary for us to reach a sustainable budget at some point. But again, I will defer to the committee that did all the research and made the recommendations as to the when, and stick to the how, or the, eventually we'll be talking about it. There's no doubt about it, so.
We had a group of very involved citizens a few years ago, the Save Our Schools citizens, who worked really hard on getting an override that was critically necessary at that time, and it didn't work. We can't allow that to happen again. WHRSD, you have some things there that look kind of interesting.
Right. Now, these are, agenda items. Again, this list was forwarded through the town administrator to, get to the Board of Selectmen to jointly create an agenda. So I'm glad to see they're all on the agenda. Whitman Hanson, obviously, is our biggest town department. So I think we need to spend some time, and beyond this meeting, I would suggest, to talk about several things. And the first item that's on there is the pay to ride, or talking about implementing a program that initiates people who live with, not mandated to be bused, a program that would help fund that. So families that have students that live less than 1.5 miles from the school would have an opportunity to bus those students at a cost. So just for the Board of Selectmen, we have discussed this many times within the Finance Committee over the years. Don Byers did provide us with some information from the Manchester Essex Regional School District that kind of spells out a program, and I would suggest if you want to take a look at that, it shows how easily the program can be established. And obviously, we talked about this last year. There was some concern about, families' ability to pay, or, that it would be some hardship on individuals. But I think this is a discussion that needs to take place. I think we need to make a responsible evaluation of such a program. So that's the reason why I put it on the agenda and open it for
Does the
discussion.
Finance Committee have an opinion on it?
We haven't taken a formal vote, but again, this is something that we would hope be a joint discussion with the Board of Selectmen to see.
It's come up the last few years, so obviously.
Yeah,
it's
I was
in
just going to
thought.
say that. I was on the Finance Committee for fiscal
It's in our
1920.
thoughts.
I
That's
know you
something
guys
that
just
we
met with
looked
the
at.
school committee and the superintendent. What was his thought process on it?
Well, I'm going to have to defer to Dave because I wasn't at that meeting. Did you discuss this?
We did not.
Okay. So again, this is,
Have we discussed like any, it may be something to bring up is implement, how would he implement this? What does he feel? How do we know exactly what this is going to save? Would he need to put out some type of feeler for the students? Does he need a lead time telling parents he would be stopping busing? I think there is a lot more to this than just a dollar figure.
And what would happen to the existing busing contract?
right. Well, those were questions that we discussed with the superintendent last year. We asked for the implications to
the funding would be
to the contract if this program was implemented, if you recall, when you were on the Finance Committee. So, the discussions have been had. I just think it's time to consider alternate funding sources that would maybe address some of the school's needs by
It is a
increasing.
dollar issue. There's a lot of dollars there. There's a lot of other towns that do have a system in place now. We're struggling for money. We're looking for money in any way we can. It's another way that working families have to come up with it, but it's working in other communities.
Any comment on that, Ken?
397,000 last year.
Right. I can remember when the non-mandated busing was voted on by the school committee to do that, and it was in the one budget of transportation. And then when times were tough, they were going to stop non-mandated, so the town meeting decided, well, we'll take it out of the school budget and we'll put it in Article 2. Same thing with the crossing guards. So we're paying for the non-mandated busing. I guess my question would be, if in fact they decide to put a cost on that as far as ridership, 50 cents a route, whatever it is, right? That money being collected, where would it go? Would it go to the bottom line of the school, or would it come into our general fund?
These are things that have to be discussed.
Well, if we're paying for it,
Right.
right, you would think it would come into our general fund.
So would you want to manage that system?
Well, I don't know,
I
but
think the money would go to the organization that has the ability to manage that pay-as-you-go program, and that program would,
but
management could only be done by
unfortunately,
the
how
schools.
would it just
I
go to
think
the
it's
bottom
more
line?
simple
From
than
their
that.
website.
I think what you have here is $300,000 that, 390, that
400,000.
1.2,
1,000 here, 1,000 there, soon you're talking money.
whatever.
The
It's
focus there.
$400,000 that the meeting members of town meeting have for a long time
That's-
agreed to pay.
That's correct. And the focus on this is, I believe, a way to say, here's 400 more that we can contribute to school district operations by having people pay to transport students. And there are a myriad of issues that are going to come up with this. I happen to drop my grandkids off at school or pick them up periodically, and there are significant limitations on that. I usually come in somewhere around 7:30. At 8:15, I'll run home, pick them up, and drop them at the Conley. I can't do it any earlier than that because they won't let them in before 8:25. Now, a lot of these kids that are riding are children of working families. Both parents are working, and they rely on the bus to help them take care of what they can't do. Now, it's easy to say, well, that's fine, pay for it. But it's a complicated issue.
Mandated busing pickup.
Or walk.
Or you can walk, yeah. Here's it,
What we're
you
coming
know,
down to.
you
It's
quickly.
pay or walk, really.
You want a 6 or 7-year-old walking to school?
But you brought up something, the start time, and I think we were talking a little bit about this. You're saying that we're the earliest, probably in the nation. Massachusetts has the earliest start times generally across America, and we are one of the earliest within Massachusetts. So we also have to think about how effective is our money spent? How effective, if children, all the studies, California just said, hey, we're not going to even let kids come in early. So great, we get them there when their parents need them. We're not babysitters. We're educating them. That's what we're doing. Half those buses are coming in empty. So we're paying for a bus to get a kid to school where they aren't learning effectively. So we're not getting the best bang for our buck. We're not, what are we exactly doing here? Now, I'm going to just look at this from a standpoint of finance. How do we get the best bang for our buck and the most effective? All of the examples that I have seen don't do that. They get kids to school early, to increase anxiety, not be educated as effectively, and we're paying for empty buses. The parents are mostly driving them anyway. So I just don't see where this is cost effective. It does give this opportunity to make it cheaper for us to start a later school time. We can kill two birds with one stone here, and I hope people can start to
Well, this is
think in that
obviously a
way.
discussion that isn't going to end tonight, so.
Right, yeah, no, Fred has a...
As far as the later school times, I'm not going to beat that horse dead, but we had our student council come up last school committee meeting, and all of the students that were there spoke how they like an earlier time. And
that's
as
what
they
they
said, if they were to have a later time, they would be getting out later. Still the same amount of time, so they would, either you go to bed earlier or you sleep later.
They didn't say
One
that.
thing we'd have to be cognizant of with non-mandated busing, if we start charging, now you're going to have more attrition, more parents driving, but you still have to provide that big bus. So I don't know that our cost necessarily goes down.
But, okay, yeah.
That's something that would have to be studied quite intensively.
Yeah, this is a discussion. We're
I
not
would
gonna
be
come to a
careful.
conclusion on tonight.
I was there at that meeting. Well, the children, kids that had gone, these were all senior girls. They had managed to do well, so obviously they adapted to their environment. But that generally affects boys more than girls. So I don't know if we would use 4 girls as our example to just sort of run that. That would be irresponsible. They did say it was.
Subset of the population of our
It
students, though.
they did say it was hard for them in the beginning. They did say. So by the time you get to a senior, then it's easier. But, they did say that they were trying, they were very, very wonderful girls, actually. They were trying to find that balanced voice. But they did say it was hard to adjust to. So, and it is the earliest in the nation,
I'm
guys.
just going to call a timeout, because this is kind of what I try to avoid as chairman of the budget committee. This is when we're getting into scope creep, okay? This is what we're doing. This is a school committee issue.
Right.
If the school committee comes to you, the FinCom,
Yeah.
and says they need X dollar to start a universal start time, then that's what you need to discuss. Or, as a private citizen, Rosemary, you go to the school committee and advocate for it. There's nothing wrong with that. But you need to look at what the superintendent and the school committee is giving you. You cannot put your own personal agenda on things. I'm
Finance
sorry.
Committee is a watchdog for money. I am advocating for how best to spend
Okay,
our
but
money.
that is
As a
not how the
citizen,
superintendent is asking you to spend his money.
well, it's not his money, Randy. It's the citizens' money.
Okay.
So be careful.
I've-
There's no
I've-
creeping with a watchdog. We
Okay.
watch over everything. I think you misrepresented the Finance Committee's role.
No, I don't
Yeah,
think so.
and there's no
I
creeping on
disagree
an
with you.
oversight
I'm not going to
committee.
argue with you, but
Thank you.
when the superintendent calls for a list of priorities, what he asks to add, that is what you watch over. He has yet to ask for that, but yet I see that this subset pushing that. Okay, you're going beyond, you're going outside of what you're supposed to be doing. Unless you're going to these meetings as a private citizen advocating, which, you know what? I commend you for doing. Everyone has things they're going to advocate for. But as a FinCom member, as a Board of Selectmen member, as a school committee member, you cannot take, well, as a school committee member, you can. You can't look at just the earth as a flat piece of land. You need to look at the global picture. Okay, and that's what we're not doing. The superintendent puts a budget in front of the school district. Why are you laughing at me, Rosemary? That's very, you know what, that's
I
very
didn't laugh
rude. You're sitting there laughing. You know, okay?
Randy, stop your theatrics.
You know,
I did not.
I've tried to stop this conversation 2 or 3 times because I don't think it's productive.
Well, I think, Mr. Chairman, in
Something
next
that can happen.
steps, I mean, we go to next steps. Obviously, you know, this is a preliminary discussion about this. I do respectfully disagree that this is a scope creep because the Finance Committee is having this discussion on an annual basis to look at revenue, sources of revenue.
School committee recommended this.
The discussion will be with the school committee, and that's where it will go. So that is the next step, Mr. Chairman. I yield on this one particular
Okay,
agenda item.
you have a minute left.
Thanks.
What about assessment?
So I think, yeah, this is obviously, you know, an important issue, and I think it was one, you know, that has been discussed at length. The position of the Finance Committee has been very well publicized. I guess the reason I added this to the agenda was to get the position of the Board of Selectmen on the
I
assessment.
believe we voted that
I think-
unanimously.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we basically started the discussion on it when we voted unanimously a while ago to go with the statutory method. And as far as I understand, that's what's going to happen.
Okay, in subsequent years, that's the position of the Board of
Well,
Selectmen.
in subsequent years, there still may be more discussions.
Okay.
And who knows what will happen with that. I don't want to get into a big discussion about the statutory method right now.
Right.
Because,
But it does affect our budget. It does affect our.
well, it does. Sure it does. It's affected it,
So
it has affected it for a long time.
Right. So if we
Not-
talk about sustainability, this is something that, you know, as uncomfortable as it is to discuss, it is something that we have to continue to discuss until we have a permanent solution and not a year-to-year solution.
Right,
Right?
right.
It has to be voted on an annual basis. That's part of the statute.
Right.
So you can't say that we're going agreement method for the next 10 years, or we're going statutory for the next 10 years. Each year, it has to be voted independently.
And that's a point that has been lost in the discussions that I've heard. Ever since the change was made and the phrase statutory assessment came into effect, there should have been a vote by the school committee every year to decide which one to take. It wasn't taken.
Right.
It wasn't taken. And so we lived with that for a long time, whether it wasn't taken for ignorance, whether it wasn't taken for laziness, whether it was whatever reason it wasn't taken for, it wasn't taken. We've caught up to that, and I think it's. I'm glad that you said what you said, because it is a vote that has to be taken every year so that people can consider it. I don't want to talk much more about it because I get
I don't think there's any.
I think we beat it to death for the time being.
Yes, yes.
We have to move forward.
Right. MSBA grant.
So you discussed this early part of the meeting about the grant and the funding source for the grant. Mr. Lineham.
The MSBA grant, what we have right now is an invitation to seek assistance from the MSBA. In order to do that, we have to do a facility feasibility study and facility evaluation and a design. So we will actually have to reach out, if we're going to accept this opportunity. In May, we will have to vote to call for a funding for a feasibility study. That study will include several components. One will be demographics, one will be utility, and one will be design. What type of facility are we going to build? Is it going to be a new structure? Is it going to be a renovation? And I know Scott's had a shot at this, and I will too. I don't see anybody ever approving us renovating that building. So if we're going to do something there, we're most likely looking at a new building construction. So the first step is getting this assessment done, and then going to MSBA and seeking funding, approval and funding. That decision has to be made in May. Should be made before then, it'll be on the warrant, but we have to figure out how we're going to do this, if we're going to do it. If we are, how we're going to do it. Does it get funded through, as John Madden had recommended, a debt plan? Does it get funded out of free cash? Does it get funded out of a one-time capital override? These were all the options that were discussed at the Budget Override Committee. And the recommendation of the committee is to pay for it out of free cash. I have some reservations about it, but I voted for that. My reservations are simply, we're not voting to spend $750,000. We're going to be voting to spend $38 million. So the approval ultimately for that process is going to come from the voters at a ballot box. So I was persuaded by arguments that the feasibility study, if conducted, will give us the information we need to present to the public. Chris, good job on that. It was persuasive, because if we call for a capital override or a debt exclusion, there's a possibility that we won't get the support we need to complete that study. That kills it right then and there. We have nowhere to go. We go back to the drawing board. If we fund a feasibility study and we collect the information that's necessary to make that evaluation, then we move forward. So that's going to be something for discussion with the Finance Committee on their recommendation on how to fund that, with the Board of Selectmen, and ultimately with the people who show up at town meeting.
So I think the three options are really what we're considering. So the free cash option, or a one-time capital exclusion, or debt exclusion bonded over a specific period. So again, that next steps, the Board of Selectmen and the Finance Committee just have to come to some conclusion as to which direction to go. So, but obviously coming out of the Budget Override Evaluation Committee.
I knew I couldn't keep them down.
Well, just make a quick comment. I think all of these things come together, right? There's a
And you are?
Chris George, 4 Shelley Lane, who's also a member of the Budget Override Evaluation Committee. I think a lot of these things come together. The recommendation not to go for an override for the next fiscal year, the recommendation to use free cash to fund $750,000. There are a lot of moving parts. A lot of those have been discussed tonight. There are other moving parts at the state level. We're going to get a change in the funding formula of the schools. We don't exactly know how that's going to affect us yet, regardless of what method is used, right? So there are a lot of moving pieces here. As mentioned, we've got one shot to go. I think if we start doing, some capital overrides or debt exclusions before we know what we're going to ask for in a year or two from an override perspective, that's a bad idea. That maybe hurts us when we go to the well. At the same time, getting invited to MSBA is really important. There's a lot of money on the table there from the state. We know we have to do something with the middle school. It's not something we can kick down the road. There's money available in free cash. Weighing that against all the other capital projects that the Collins Center recommended, this was right at the top of the list. To me, there's no reason not to use the money that's available. If there's merit to go for a debt exclusion for something else at the same time, so be it. I understand Frank's argument. It has a lot of merit to it, but there's a lot of questions that we can't answer without that study. So how do we go to the public and make a case when we don't have those answers yet? So that's what it came down to for me. I apologize, I missed the earlier meeting. I got stuck at work. I was at my desk, so I couldn't get away when they came over, but that's just where I was coming from.
Great, thank you, Chris. Audit funding.
And the final piece was for the audits. I know we've had this discussion with the town administrator on the best scenario for creating the funding source for the audit. Frank Ann?
Well, essentially, Hanson and Whitman have agreed to seek an audit, an operational audit of the school district. The pieces are being put together. The cost could be anywhere from $40,000 to $60,000. We have agreed to cover half that cost. Unfortunately, we don't have that money sitting in a line that can say, let's use this for audit. So after looking over a number of options, I have two budgets from which I can take some of the money, but $10,000 to $12,000 is going to have to come from the Finance Committee in order for us to, if the audit costs as much as we think it is. If there's less, then it'll be less of an impact. But right now, the reserve fund is only at $31,200.
$31,200, yeah.
So in other times, I might have gone to them and say, hey, I need $30,000. Can you commit it, and we'll squeak by on the 20. The 20's already gone.
Right, yeah.
So it'll be coming out of a couple of places. I know the Board of Selectmen voted to support the calling for the audit and to pay for half of it. We're putting the pieces together, and I won't know anything more until we actually get responses from the solicitation.
So as far as next steps go with that, I would just suggest that, once the information comes forward, the Finance Committee would be prepared to vote to use a sum of money from the reserve fund in order to complete the amount of funding we need for that.
This is really just a next steps process like we did, only for the schools. So we have a better understanding. I mean, it only helps everyone if we can identify trends and projections.
Does the state audit, the school does, that's required, that's not helpful to you to do that?
Well, the state really doesn't audit.
I mean, the school does its own audit in every year.
And that, if you consider $38 million spent in one area and $6 million in another as a well-defined opportunity, no.
One of the parts of the new legislation coming up is that you're going to have to be clearer about how money affects education. Do we want to wait to see what those regulations are before we go and spend $30,000? A couple of weeks before to see what the new changes in educational law, because part of it is that they're holding schools more accountable to how they spend money.
Well, and that's part of what we're trying to do.
Exactly, but do you want to double up if they're going to be required to do that within their budget already?
Well,
Soon.
are they going to tell us what they've done? I mean, this is a perspective thing.
Can we get the money back?
No, I'm saying that's an oversimplification. You're talking about a perspective program. I'm talking about looking back and setting benchmarks by identifying what we've done in the past, just like we did when we did this look back or audit by Mr. Madden. And if you wait, we're never going to reach a conclusion with Hanson, and we're never going to fully understand what we're going into because, again, they're not going to look backwards. I've looked at 3 years of financials from Whitman Hanson. They don't help at all. They're just large sums of money.
Isn't the audit that's being proposed much more encompassing to also include all the revolving accounts?
Yes.
Everything,
Okay.
yeah.
Et cetera, so it's far, far
Indeed.
more encompassing. The audit that we get on an annual basis is pretty much just procedural.
They look at your statements and they say, yeah, you're okay.
Okay, thank you. Fred.
Thank you. So we can't use any of that.
Okay, so what's the timing for our next joint meeting, do you think?
I would say
Given
when
everything
we
we're
meet
talking
with
about.
the budget managers, we're going to have a good sense of, where we can put together a realistic Article 2, and then I think then to jointly meet with the Board of Selectmen to go over, generally, I'm not saying a line-by-line Article 2, but a generally, bottom line for each department type of look at the Article 2. And
February
then
25th.
maybe at that point, we'll have a recommendation from the Capital Committee that we could look at to where we're going for capital needs as well, so.
Okay, good.
I think this was a great first step. I appreciate getting the time to come before the committee.
And I'm glad you're sitting at a table that's appropriate.
Me too.
Unless there's anything else, a motion to adjourn is in order.
So moved.
Second. All those in favor?
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
So if you want to reconvene,